Imagine an aircraft, right? It can fly incredibly slowly, almost hover in place, land pretty much anywhere, but it's definitely not a helicopter. How does a machine like that even work? And, well, if it's got all these advantages, why don't we see them everywhere?
That's a fantastic question to start with. It really gets to the heart of this aircraft's, let's say, unique position. It sort of occupies its own fascinating space, blending elements you'd normally associate with planes and helicopters.
Welcome, everyone, to The Deep Dive, a special edition from the Science Corner podcast. We love taking your curiosity and really exploring these intriguing topics. And today, we are diving deep into exactly that kind of aircraft, the remarkable and often misunderstood autogyro. You might also hear it called a gyrocopter or gyroplane.
Yeah, and our mission for this deep dive really is to unpack how these things actually fly, the design principles. We'll trace its surprisingly important history and touch on some of the incredible records and uses it seen. It's a story of innovation that actually really did pave the way for modern helicopters, and, well, it keeps finding new jobs even today.
Okay, let's get into the nuts and bolts then. Autogyro, gyrocopter, gyroplane, are those basically all the same thing? And the big question: how does it stay airborne if the main rotor on top isn't powered like a helicopter's? That seems counterintuitive.
Good place to start. And yes, fundamentally, autogyro, gyrocopter, gyroplane, they all refer to the same type of rotorcraft. The absolute key difference is this principle called autorotation. Think of it like this. A helicopter uses its engine to force air down through the main rotors. That's powered lift.
Right.
And autogyro's main rotor, though, is unpowered. It spins freely. The lift comes from air flowing upwards through that rotor disc as the aircraft moves forward.
So wait, the forward movement makes the air go up through the rotor, and that makes it spin and lift, almost like a windmill, but generating lift instead of power.
That's a pretty good analogy, actually. The blades are angled just right, so as air moves up and back across them, it creates lift, yes, but it also provides the force to keep the rotor turning. It's sort of a self-sustaining cycle once it gets going. The lift generated helps maintain a stable rotor speed, balancing out the drag. Autorotation. That's the magic.
That is genuinely clever. Okay, so if the main rotor isn't pushing it up or forward, what provides the thrust? It can't just lift straight off the ground like a helicopter, can it?
Exactly, you've got it.
Yeah.
Forward thrust comes from somewhere else, usually a standard engine-driven propeller, like you'd find on a small plane. That propeller can be mounted on the front, or more commonly these days, on the back.
Okay.
And because it needs that forward motion to get air flowing up through the rotor to generate lift, autogyros generally can't do a true vertical takeoff. They need a bit of a takeoff roll, like an airplane, although a strong headwind can shorten that considerably, or using something called a pre-rotator.
A pre-rotator. We'll get to that. But first, controlling this hybrid thing. How does a pilot manage flight when you've got, airplane dynamics and rotor dynamics all mixed together?
It is a unique mix. You've got three main controls. There's a control stick, often called a cyclic, which tilts the whole rotor disc. Tilt it forward or back for pitch, side to side for roll. Then you have rudder pedals for yaw, just like in a fixed-wing plane. And finally, a throttle for the engine that's providing that forward push.
Okay, that makes sense. Now tell me about this pre-rotator you mentioned. And are there any other sort of unusual controls specific to autogyros?
Right, the pre-rotator. It's pretty important for practical operation. Before takeoff, you engage it. It uses the engine, usually through a clutch and drive shaft, to spin the main rotor up to speed before you start rolling forward. This cuts down the takeoff distance dramatically.
Ah, I see. Gets the rotor going so you don't need as much runway.
Precisely. Now, unlike helicopters, most autogyros don't have what's called collective pitch control. That's where the pilot can change the angle of all the rotor blades at once. But interestingly, a few specific models, like the old Air and Space 18A, did have collective. That allowed them to do near vertical takeoffs and landings, almost like a helicopter. But that's quite rare.
Fascinating. So thinking about the overall layout, you mentioned the propeller could be front or back. What are the pros and cons there?
Well, broadly, you have the tractor configuration, where the engine and prop are out front pulling the aircraft. This was common on the early autogyros. The main advantages are potentially better yaw stability, and it can be easier to align the thrust line with the center of mass, which helps avoid some instability issues.
And the pusher config, propeller at the back.
Exactly. Engine and prop are behind the cockpit and the rotor mast. This layout really took off after World War II, largely thanks to Dr. Igor Benson and his popular gyrocopter kits.
Ah,
The big pluses for the pusher are simplicity. It tends to be lighter and Maybe most obviously, you get a fantastic, unobstructed view forward. Most modern autogyros you see built today follow this pusher design.
That's a really clear breakdown of how these machines work, but every invention has an origin story, and the autogyros starts with, well, a crash and a determined engineer, right?
Let's talk about Juan de la Cierva.
Yes, this is where the why behind the autogyro really comes into focus.
Mhm.
Juan de la Cierva was a Spanish engineer, quite brilliant, also an inventor and a pilot. Back in 1921, he designed this big three-engine bomber.
Okay.
During an early test flight, tragically, it stalled at low speed and crashed. This deeply affected de la Cierva. He became convinced there had to be a way to build an aircraft that was inherently safe at low speeds, one that couldn't stall like that. That became his mission.
And the autogyro, his autogyro, was the answer, often called the forerunner to the helicopter. That's right. His first properly successful rotorcraft, which he specifically named Autogyro, took its first flight in January 1923 in Madrid. It looked a bit like the airplanes of the day, but it had this crucial unpowered rotor on a mast above the fuselage. That flight really marked the birth of a whole new class of aircraft.
What was the big breakthrough? I mean, people had been tinkering with rotary wings for a while, often without much luck regarding stability. What did de la Cierva figure out?
After a few initial attempts that weren't quite stable, his real genius showed in the C.4 model. He introduced something absolutely critical, flapping hinges on the rotor hub.
Flapping hinges?
Yes. These allowed each individual rotor blade to flap up and down as it went around. This might sound simple, but it solved a massive aerodynamic problem called dissymmetry of lift. Basically, the advancing blade moving into the wind generates more lift than the retreating blade moving away from the wind. Without the flapping hinge, this difference would just tip the aircraft over violently.
So the flapping blades automatically balanced out the lift. That sounds fundamental.
It was fundamental, absolutely pivotal, and the proof came just 3 days after the C.4's first flight. The engine failed right after takeoff. But instead of crashing, the autogyro, thanks to those hinges and autorotation, just settled down slowly and steeply, landing safely. That single event demonstrated the inherent safety potential he was aiming for, and really validated the whole concept. It laid down principles helicopters still rely on.
Incredible. A safe landing after engine failure in 1923 in a rotary wing aircraft. That must have turned some heads internationally.
It certainly did. He refined the design with the C.6 model, which made a quite significant 10.5-kilometer flight in 1925. That success caught the eye of James G. Weir, a Scottish industrialist. Weir was so impressed he helped establish the Cierva Autogyro Company in England that same year. Britain then became really a world hub for autogyro development for a while.
And the improvements kept coming.
Oh, yes. There was a minor setback in 1926, a crash due to stress on the blade roots. This led to another key innovation, the drag hinge, added to the C.8 model. This allowed the blades to move slightly forward and backward in the plane of rotation, relieving those stresses.
Okay, so flapping up and down and dragging fore and aft. More stable again.
Exactly. More durable, more stable. And this improved C.8 was the machine that made the first ever crossing of the English Channel by a rotorcraft in 1928. A huge milestone.
So by the late 20s, early 30s, it sounds like the autogyro was really proving itself. Did it catch on in the U.S. too?
It did. An American industrialist, Harold Pitcairn, saw a demonstration, particularly the safe vertical descent capability after an engine cut, and was just blown away. He went to England, met de la Cierva, licensed the designs, and founded the Pitcairn Autogyro Company in the U.S. Around the same time, Focke-Wulf in Germany also licensed the technology.
What about making them easier to operate? Spinning that big rotor up must have been awkward at first.
Very awkward. Early methods were pretty basic. Sometimes they'd literally use a team of people pulling a rope wrapped around the rotor hub, or they'd tried deflecting the propeller slipstream with tail surfaces. Not ideal. But in 1932, Pitcairn's company in the U.S. cracked it with a proper engine-driven mechanical transmission system to pre-rotate the rotor. That made things much more practical.
A big step. And I think you mentioned direct control earlier. That sounds important too.
Hugely important.
Yeah.
De la Cierva wasn't done innovating. He developed a rotor hub that the pilot could directly tilt using the control stick. This gave much better, much more positive control, especially at low airspeeds where traditional airplane controls like ailerons become sluggish.
Yeah.
This direct control rotor first appeared on the C-9 MKV and then became standard on the very successful Cierva C30 series from 1934 onwards.
And the C30, that model had some significant firsts, didn't it?
It really did. A C-30 performed the first takeoff and landing by a rotorcraft on a ship, the Spanish Navy seaplane Tender Daedalo in 1934. Quite a feat. And later that same year, during a revolt in Spain, a C-30 flew reconnaissance missions, marking the very first time a rotorcraft was used by the military in an operational role.
So all these advancements, growing utility, it sounds like the autogyro was poised for takeoff, pardon the pun. Why didn't it become, the dominant aircraft type it seemed destined to be? What held it back as helicopters started appearing?
That is the crucial question, isn't it? While autogyros offered amazing low-speed safety and could land in very short spaces, they still had limitations compared to what helicopters were starting to promise. They couldn't truly hover motionless for extended periods, and they couldn't lift straight up vertically without any forward roll, generally speaking.
Right, the VTOL capability.
Exactly. As helicopter designs matured, particularly with reliable ways to counteract torque, like the tail rotor, they offered that extra bit of versatility for certain jobs, rescue, precise lifting, things like that. So helicopters kind of stole the limelight, and the autogyro got a bit sidelined, even though arguably simpler and in some ways safer. There were also some technical challenges, like susceptibility to ground resonance, a kind of vibration on the ground, which needed careful design and piloting.
So a classic case of a simpler tech being leapfrogged by something more complex, but ultimately more versatile for key applications. Still, it didn't disappear. You mentioned military use. It seems like it found some specific wartime roles.
It absolutely did, quite critical niche roles. During the Winter War between Finland and the Soviet Union, 1939-40, the Soviets actually used armed Kamo the A-7 autogyros. These weren't just recon. They were armed with machine guns, sometimes rockets or bombs, used for correcting artillery fire. They flew combat missions, remarkably, without any losses. These were arguably the first combat-designed rotary-wing aircraft.
Wow, an armed combat autogyro back then? That's not something you hear about often. What about in World War II prior?
Well, in the UK, the Royal Air Force used a military version of the C-30 called the Avro Rota. Their job. Incredibly important. Calibrating the coastal radar stations during the Battle of Britain and after. Making sure those radar readings were accurate was vital for defense.
Okay, a very specific technical role.
Yes. And Germany had something quite different. The Focke-Kelis Fa-330, nicknamed Boxstelz or Wagtail. It was tiny, basically a one-man gyroglider kite. It had no engine. U-boats would tow it behind them on a long cable.
A kite towed by a submarine. Seriously, what for?
Surveillance. The U-boat would surface, assemble, and launch this little rotor kite with an observer in it. Towed along, the airflow would spin the rotor, lifting the observer maybe a few hundred feet up. From there, they could spot Allied convoys much further away than from the deck of the sub. Quite ingenious, though I imagine rather terrifying for the observer. They had to be quickly retrieved or even jettisoned if Allied aircraft appeared.
That is genuinely wild, like something out of a movie. What about the Pacific Theater?
Japan also got involved. The Imperial Japanese Army developed the Kayabaka-1 autogyro, based on an American Kellett design they'd imported. They used it for the usual things like reconnaissance and artillery spotting, but also, crucially, for anti-submarine patrols from small escort carriers. And apparently they were credited with sinking at least one Allied submarine.
So, despite being overshadowed, it really carved out these important niches during the war. What happened afterwards? Did it fade away again, or did it see another revival?
It definitely saw a revival, maybe even a resurrection of sorts, largely thanks to one man, Dr. Igor Benson. He was a Russian immigrant engineer in the U.S. He'd seen captured German Fa-330 gyrogliders and was inspired, building on earlier British rotor kite ideas, too. His focus was on simplicity.
Right, you mentioned his gyrocopter earlier.
Yeah. Exactly. He designed the Benson B-7 in 1955, and then the very famous B-8M. These were typically simple open-frame designs, often using surplus McCulloch drone engines. They were designed to be built from plans or kits by amateurs. The B-8M was even tested by the U.S. Air Force briefly as the X-25.
Making them accessible to home builders, that must have really popularized them, but maybe brought some issues too.
A real double-edged sword. It absolutely democratized rotary wing flight for thousands of people. Building and flying your own gyrocopter became a popular hobby, but this accessibility had a downside. Some early home-built designs, and maybe some misunderstanding of the principles, led to designs with a dangerous mismatch between the propeller's thrust line and the aircraft's center of gravity.
Oh.
Yeah, this could lead to a very dangerous instability called power pushover or buntover, where adding power could cause the nose to pitch down uncontrollably. Sadly, there were accidents, and this gave autogyros a bit of a poor safety reputation for a while, which was really the opposite of de la Cierva's original goal. Modern designs, thankfully, have engineered these problems out with careful design.
The tough learning curve. Were there any successful commercial autogyro ventures around that time or later?
There were attempts. Several designs actually achieved full FAA-type certification,
Hmm.
like the Umball U-18, which became the Air and Space 18A, and the McCulloch J-2. But for a mix of reasons, market timing, economics, maybe that lingering safety perception, none of them really achieved sustained commercial success.
Hmm. But development didn't stop entirely. You mentioned Ken Wallace in the UK.
Right, Wing Commander Ken Wallace, a real character and brilliant innovator. In the 60s and onwards, he developed a series of his own miniature autogyros, Wallace autogyros. They were incredibly compact and agile. They were used for military research, police surveillance trials, scientific work, and famously one starred in the James Bond film You Only Live Twice, Little Nelly.
Little Nelly, of course. Okay, so these things keep finding uses. Did anyone ever try anything really out there propulsion-wise, like a jet engine?
Believe it or not, yes.
Yeah.
There was an experimental project called the Kaman KSA 100 SAVER. SAVER stood for Stowable Aircrew Vehicle Escape Rotoseat. The idea was pretty radical. It was a jet-powered autogyro escape system built into an ejection seat for combat jets.
An ejectable autogyro seat.
Essentially, yes. If the pilot ejected, this small turbine-powered autogyro was meant to deploy, allowing the pilot to fly away from the danger zone rather than just parachuting down. Only one prototype was built and never went into service, but it just shows the kind of outside-the-box thinking autogyro is sometimes inspired.
That is amazing. Okay, let's bring it up to the present day, the 21st century. Are autogyros still relevant? Are they just hobbyist machines now, or do they have real-world modern jobs?
Oh, they definitely have practical, modern roles, especially in areas like security and law enforcement. A good example, back in 2002, for the Winter Olympics in Salt Lake City, a Groen Brothers Aviation Hawk 4 autogyro flew perimeter security patrols. It completed something like 67 missions over 75 hours, apparently without any maintenance issues. And that's not isolated. It's estimated over 1,000 autogyros are used by various authorities worldwide now.
1,000? That's quite a fleet. Why choose them over helicopters for these roles?
Well, a big factor is cost, both purchase price and operating costs. They tend to be significantly cheaper. The police department in Tomball, Texas, for instance, looked into using one. They figured it would cost maybe $75,000 to buy and only about $50 an hour to run. Compare that to a helicopter.
Yeah, that's a huge difference.
Exactly. And their flight characteristics, slow flight capability, short field performance, are often perfectly suited for surveillance and patrol. We're seeing international adoption, too. Since around 2009, authorities in Iraqi Kurdistan have been using them for things like airport security and police training.
Interesting. So, beyond official duties, is that spirit of adventure still there? Are people pushing the limits with them?
Absolutely. That adventurous side is very much alive. There was a German couple, Melanie and Andreas Stutzfor. Between 2009 and 2010, they flew the first world tour by Autogyro. Not a single machine the whole way. They used different types in different regions: Europe, Africa, Australia, the Americas. An incredible journey. They even wrote a book about it, Weltflug, World Flight.
A world tour by Autogyro. That takes some serious dedication. And speaking of pushing limits, Autogyros have racked up some pretty impressive world records over the years, haven't they?
They certainly have. Altitude, speed, endurance, they've challenged them all. Going way back, the famous Amelia Earhart actually set the women's world altitude record for autogyros in 1931, flying a Pitcairn PCA-2 to over 18,400 feet.
Wow, Amelia Earhart flew them too.
Yes, and incredibly, her record stood for 84 years. It was finally broken in 2015 by an Italian pilot, Donatella Ricci. She flew her autogyro to an amazing 8,399 meters. That's over 27,500 feet, setting not just a new women's record, but the new overall altitude record for autogyros. A huge leap.
That's incredible, nearly 10,000 feet higher. What about speed and distance records?
Well, Ken Wallace, who we mentioned earlier with Little Nelly, held numerous records for many years, including speed records over set distances and longest nonstop flights. He was still setting records into his late 80s. In 2002, at age 89, he set a new speed record, making him the oldest pilot ever to set an aviation world record.
89 and setting speed records. Amazing.
Truly. And then there's Andrew Keach in the U.S. In 2003, he flew his home-built autogyro across the continental U.S., breaking a record that had stood for 72 years. He also set several speed records over closed courses. These pilots really show what modern autogyros are capable of.
Okay, so altitude, speed, distance. What about the ultimate challenge, flying one around the world? I heard that was a tough nut to crack for autogyros.
It was. For a long time, the autogyro was one of the very last types of aircraft not to have circumnavigated the globe. There was a major attempt in 2004 called Expedition Global Eagle. They did set a record for the longest overwater flight by an autogyro Muscat to Karachi, But unfortunately, they had to abandon the full circumnavigation due to weather and other issues.
So who finally did it?
It took two very determined British pilots, completing it in slightly different ways. First was Norman Surplus. Between 2010 and, believe it or not, 2019, it took him nearly 9 years due to massive delays. Especially getting permission to fly through Russia, he completed the first physical circumnavigation.
9 years.
Yes, incredible persistence. He flew about 27,000 nautical miles through 32 countries. His flight included the first ever autogyro crossings of Russia and the Bering Strait. He wasn't aiming for speed, but he set 19 official world records along the way.
Just amazing dedication. And the second pilot, you said there were two.
Right. The second was James Ketchell, also from the UK. In 2019, he completed the first officially certified speed around the world eastbound circumnavigation by Autogyro. He did it in 175 days, covering nearly 45,000 kilometers. He earned a Guinness World Record for that feat. It really cemented the Autogyro's capability on a global scale.
What an incredible story for this aircraft type. From solving a safety problem back in the 20s, through all those niche roles and setbacks, to literally circling the globe and setting records. It's really a story of persistent, clever engineering.
It really is. We've traced it from de la Cierva's vision for safer flight through all those key innovations like the flapping hinges and direct control, surprising wartime contributions, the Benson-era popularization, and now its modern roles and record-breaking adventures. It's a fantastic example of a technology that just keeps finding its place.
Yeah, the so what here really seems to be about how this unique engineering approach, often living in the shadow of the helicopter, has just stubbornly persisted. It keeps finding niches where its specific advantages, simplicity, cost, low-speed handling really shine, and it keeps pushing its own boundaries.
And that leads to a really interesting question to leave people with, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Thinking about the future. Given this unique package, safety, efficiency, now proven endurance, what other surprising roles could the Autogyro step into? Could we see it play a bigger part in things like personal air travel, maybe accessing remote areas more affordably? And perhaps more broadly, what lessons can we take from the Autogyro's long, sometimes winding path about the value of persistent innovation, even for ideas that aren't always in the mainstream spotlight?